Thank you, Susie, for the introduction. This has been a really thoughtful and thought-provoking and eye-opening conference thus far. I've learned so much from all of you already, and I think first and foremost, something I've learned is the importance of acknowledging the ground on which we gather. And so thank you also to, I don't think Len Collard is here, but to the Noongar people. And this is an uncommon practice in the United States, but one that really reminds us that our histories are written in the landscape itself. And I think that is also part of the work that we do. When I accepted Jane's really wonderful invitation to participate in this gathering back in March, I was simply looking forward to joining an international conversation around photography's political and affective charge. And of course, that was, so much has happened since then. Brexit hadn't happened, the US election hadn't happened, and now I think we stand on the verge of what is looking and feeling, and certainly from my position in the United States, like a march towards global fascism. And it seems that the task of visualizing human rights is even more pressing. I think we need to hold space for the most marginalized among us, different communities made differently precarious in the face of revanchist economic policies, an increase in hate crimes, moral panics and saber rattling around borders and immigration, heightened nationalism, xenophobia, and white supremacy, in which racism is celebrated as merely a matter of taste and discrimination. In the face of these challenges, visualizing human rights is both an act of imagination and a refusal to normalize a creeping fascism, I believe, is truly vital work. In addition to Jane for organizing this remarkable gathering, I also want to thank Denise Dalton for her incredible work in getting us all here and handling all the other logistics. And I'd like to also thank all of you, the participants, for your presentations and for this ongoing conversation. So the task of visualizing human rights often necessarily entails visualizing the human. That is, recognizing that those subjects pictured within the photographic frame fit within the often taken for granted, yet unevenly applied category of the human. Caribbean feminist philosopher Sylvia Wynter has argued that not only has Blackness stood outside of the category of human, but that the human as an Enlightenment concept is fundamentally formed in opposition to Blackness. As such, according to Wynter, the Western, quote, the Western bourgeois conception of the human man overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself. Unquote. Our species' survival then depends on rethinking our origin stories, undoing systems of racial violence and their attendant knowledge systems that produce racial violence as common sense, and retraining what Wynter calls the inner eyes that shape how we perceive reality and lead us to dehumanize others. U.S. feminist philosopher Judith Butler writes of the frames that allocate the recognizability of certain figures of the human. And these frames is linked with what she describes as broader norms that determine what will and will not be a grievable life. She continues that this field of perceptible reality is one in which the notion of the recognizable human is formed and maintained over and against what cannot be named or regarded as the human. A figure of the non-human that negatively determines and potentially unsettles the recognizably human. For Butler, these frames include the structuring constraints of genre and form. So my talk today is in part guided or inspired by these two concerns, that visualizing human rights is both a matter of rethinking who counts as human and the ways that genre and form structure that interpretation. My own scholarship has examined the role photography has played within the long African-American freedom struggle, and more recently, an African diasporic quest for justice. My interest is in how Black activists themselves utilized photography and the sorts of representational practices they developed when they understood themselves to be both photographic objects and subjects, both makers and spectators. It has long been my contention that a concern with Black visuality, not simply the visual, is inextricable from Black freedom struggles and the effort to change the conditions of Black people's lives. not least of which, to be transformed, is the individual and collective sense of one's power, efficacy, and being in the world. How we see Blackness, the meanings we attach to Black people, and the value we attach to Black life because of this sight. As art historian Sarah Lewis put it so succinctly in her introduction to the recent historic issue of Aperture magazine, quote, "The endeavor to affirm the dignity of human life cannot be waged without pictures, without representational justice. American citizenship has long been a project of vision and justice," end quote. It is not simply then that photography can alert us to human rights violations, documenting violence and atrocity, inequity and injustice, impelling us to feel and to act in the tradition of documentary photography and photojournalism. But photography can also alert us to the ways that we are disciplined to see, recognize, and acknowledge the humanity of some photographic subjects, and ignore, deny, and refuse the humanity of other subjects. Significantly, this visual disciplining happens by and through photographic genre itself. And for example, we can return here to the dialectic of the portrait and the mugshot that Alan Sekula so brilliantly laid out in his classic essay, The Body in the Archive. There, Sekula attempts to chart the paradoxes of photography by specifically drawing connections between what he calls the honorific and repressive poles of portrait practice. For Sekula, this relationship between the genre of bourgeois portraiture and the late 19th century emergence of state forms of visual control must be understood together and are most clearly articulated in the logics of the archive. Every portrait, Sekula argues, implicitly took its place within a social and moral hierarchy. Sekula avers that from the pressures placed on the interstices of the shadow archive emerged the characteristically petty bourgeois subject, pressed into compliance by a belief in the promise and threat of an imaginary class mobility, as visualized by the police profile, the mugshot, or the scientific image, and the sentimental portrait. These genres work together work to discipline their subjects and their viewers into discrete class groups, provoking both ambition, the look up, and fear, the look down. While Sekula is speaking here specifically about the function of the portrait in capitalist society, the concept also holds for considering how the multiple visual representations of African Americans and African diasporic subjects, and I would contend marginalized subjects as a whole, more broadly, were always and continue to be in intense dialogue with one another. As scientific object of study, as caricature, as criminal type, as quieted savage, as sexual predator, as entertainer, as elite athlete, as leader, as martyr, as noble sufferer. By mapping the vast, if mostly bleak terrain of photographic representation of the Black figure, we can begin to reveal the interdependence of the various subordinate archives of this larger shadow archive, articulating racial, gender, as well as class hierarchies on the social terrain. In this interdependence, we can begin to see the contradictions and ambivalences of these representations. Let's see if I can make this work. Yes, okay. Recently, tens of thousands of African Americans exploited these contradictions and ambivalences in the 2014 hashtag campaign, If They Gun Me Down, which this campaign emerged in the wake of the police murder of Ferguson, Missouri teen Michael Brown, pictured in the center. Brown's death also provided an ongoing spark for the Black Lives Matter movement, itself a movement committed to emphasizing the humanity of Black people in the context of Black death and the persistent precarity of Black life in the age of Obama. The full question behind the hashtag asked, if they gunned me down, which image would the media use to portray me? And this question drew attention to the ways in which media outlets preemptively condemn Black victims through their choice of photograph. In Brown's case, the image, the image that circulated was of him throwing up what people called a gang sign, which actually many of us would just simply call a peace sign, as opposed to a photograph that's not here, but of Brown from his high school graduation. So in the campaign, Participants juxtaposed two images of themselves. One deemed positive and socially acceptable, so graduations, military service, successful parenting. This is actually a friend of mine and his daughter. And one deemed negative, which might include profanity, alcohol, or weed, or in the case of women, provocative clothing. It is a keen 21st century example of Du Boisian double consciousness, that peculiar sensation, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, as intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois wrote so powerfully in 1903. With If They Gunned Me Down, participants announced their recognition of the burden of representation their images are made to bear, and forced a critique of the racial logics that blame black teenagers for their own murder at the hands of the state and its surrogates. And this is some of the images that circulated, the competing images that circulated of Trayvon Martin. The campaign, of course, has its limitations. The pairing of a so-called positive image with a so-called negative one lent itself to the assertion of a politics of respectability that has long beleaguered black politics. That is, by affirming the socially acceptable aspects of black lives, it potentially implies that some people are more recognizable as Western conceptions of human, that some lives are more grievable, that some victims are more deserving of justice. But even still, participants, students, activists, social service workers, teachers, military personnel, unemployed people, really just woke black folks with smartphones and Twitter accounts from all walks of life, they demonstrated two things. First, they demonstrated their acute awareness of how they, as black visual subjects, are categorized and classified in, around, and outside the category of human by media outlets, and these are folks with PhDs or not. And second, they demonstrated a clear critique of and challenge to visual aesthetics and photographic sensibilities that at once shape and are shaped by the ideology of race. So in the remainder of my talk this morning, I want to take up a specific historic example of how one activist attempted to visualize human rights between differently marginalized global subjects. Using African-American activist, anthropologist, and author Aslanda Robeson's 1936 photographs of a colonized southern Africa, I want to pay attention to two basic questions. Really, why did Robeson choose photography in the first place for her political project? And what did different forms or genres of photography allow her to express politically and affectively? And also, what might they have foreclosed? I'm interested here in what models and what dangers of photographic practice Robeson's work might offer for the task of visualizing human rights and indeed visualizing the human. Okay. A man, a woman, 5 children arranged in front of them. A fairly nondescript background. The boys are dressed similarly in button-down, short-sleeve white shirts and khaki shorts. The girls, one in front of the other, wear frocks, their hair pulled back. On one side of the photograph, the 2 oldest children at about the same height stand side by side with matching smiles and each with a half of a piece of fruit in their left hands. On the other side of the photograph, one boy smiles and another, who himself looks with surprise at the camera. The smallest child is all smile and cheeks and black girl joy. The adults stand firmly as shortly behind the children, presenting them to the camera, shielding them from whatever's behind. Hands rest on shoulders, arms touch, facial angles echo one another. They appear a family. And yet they are not, or not exactly. Taken in 1936 by Aslanda Robeson, the photograph features Zach Matthews, a teacher of Bantu studies at Fort Hare Missionary College in Alice, South Africa, Zach's wife Frida, and their 4 children. The 5th child, standing at our extreme left, is Paul Robeson Jr., the only child of Paul and Aslanda Robeson. Creating a series of circles of visual rhyming patterns, Paul Jr. is successfully enfolded into the Matthews family. Aslanda Robeson, an African-American woman born to a middle-class erudite Washington, D.C. family at the turn of the 20th century, is perhaps best known for her marriage to celebrated singer, actor, and activist Paul Robeson, whose career she managed throughout her lifetime. However, Mrs. Robeson, or Essie, as she was called by friends and family, was also an anthropologist, the author of 3 nonfiction books, and a committed anti-colonial and anti-racist activist. Eslanda and Paul Jr. were visiting the Matthews family on a 3-month trip to Uganda, South Africa, and the Belgian Congo as part of Essie's fieldwork towards her degree in anthropology at London School of Economics. Let's see, there we go. This is a map of the trip. Paul Sr. had work commitments and couldn't come, so Paul Jr. took his place. And this was the first of 3 trips Essie would make to the continent in her life and marked her effort to experience Africa firsthand, at once outside of, yet through the framework of dominant anthropology. Emboldened by brewing anti-colonial struggles and inspired by her own growing diasporic consciousness, this journey was at once academic fieldwork, political reconnaissance, and family vacation. From this trip, Robeson published the 1945 travel memoir, African Journey. This book contains more than 60 of Robeson's original photographs, including many of her son Paul Jr., or Paulie, as his parents affectionately called him. As Tina Campt, Krista Thompson, Kelly Jones, Kabata Mercer, and other scholars have argued, image making has played a critical role in both racial subject formation and the production of blackness nationally and transnationally, and has been integral to the articulation, the joining up and expression of the African diaspora. And of course, the concept of diaspora is a multifaceted and complex one that figures attachment in deferral and deferred elsewheres. It is a condition marked by scatter and the inhabiting of multiple temporalities, the prelapsarian, the daily grind, the fantasy of eventual return, the time of justice. In the context of the African diaspora, diaspora describes at once the condition of movement, migration, and exile of Black peoples forged by racial capitalism, New World slavery, imperialism, and colonialism, as a theoretical framework that enables a mode of studying and conceptualizing Black people globally, and as a process by which Black peoples understand themselves as linked, imagined through culture, cultural production, and political movements. In these ways, family has functioned as a key mode for understanding diaspora, even and especially for people who have never met and may share little beyond chosen identification. And the conventions of family photography, with its mutuality of confirming looks that construct a set of familial roles and hierarchies, to quote Mariana Hirsch, proves a particularly useful framework for considering the modes through which diaspora is constructed and works to confer belonging and reinforce the power and notion of family. So what forms of diasporic identification and belonging might have been nurtured through the presence of Eslanda's son, Paul Jr., as a photographic subject? Okay, so, oh, that's not where I wanted to go, sorry. So Robeson's photographs throughout African Journey augment her political project, in part by refusing exoticism and racial hierarchization, hallmarks of anthropology of the time. And academic anthropology itself at this time understood racial hierarchies as the natural outcome of the arrested development of groups deemed culturally and biologically inferior to Western scientists. African peoples in particular were fixed as outside history and tied to an eternal pre-modern past. Indeed, anthropology as a course of study may seem an odd choice for a committed anti-colonial activist, but for Robeson and other African diasporic intellectuals, the social sciences broadly offered a framework for addressing social problems, and anthropology presented a way of documenting and celebrating African heritage. It also provided the ability to travel to and experience other Black communities and to forge diasporic connections in real time, validated by the Academy. Obviously, anthropology was not the only arbiter of images of African peoples as primitive, and this was also characteristic of film of the period, and Essie was acutely aware of the ways such images circulated globally. "I blush with shame," Robeson reflected in African Journey, for the mental picture my fellow Negroes in America have of our African brothers, wild black savages in leopard skins, waving spears and eating raw meat, and we, with films like Sanders of the River, unwittingly helping to perpetuate this misconception. Well, there will be no sequel to Sanders. Essie was, of course, referring to the 1935 film that starred her husband, Paul Robeson, as a leopard print-clad African chief who loyally serves the British colonial regime. Essie, as his manager, had negotiated a handsome contract for this film, but could not secure rights to approve the final cut. The film's degrading images and pro-colonial sentiment pained and embarrassed the Robesons, as well as opened them up to critique from black leaders. And it made them both sensitive to their roles in future depictions of African and African-descended peoples. Such overlap between Hollywood film and scientific photography also alerts us to the ways in which the photography and visualization of racial and cultural otherness across genres could be absorbed into scientific anthropology itself. That is, while formally trained anthropologists may not have made touristic, erotic, or caricatured images of African peoples, such images were informed and legitimated by scientific anthropology. Likewise, anthropological collectors enlisted such quotidian photographs to expand their archives. Thus, as Elizabeth Edwards argues, photographs became anthropological through patterns of consumption. Now, Essie's larger political project becomes evident in the photographic work and practices of African Journey. Though new to photography and filmmaking as a practitioner at the time of the trip, Essie took hundreds of photographs and made some 20 reels of film, which unfortunately are not available to see, but we can see the photographs. Essie took great pains in putting the book together to choose the most evocative images for publication. And the images cross genres, portraiture, ethnographic evidence, landscape, casual snapshot, family portrait. The trajectory of the photographs, not only from the beginning of the book to the end, but across the span of her stay within each location, suggests that Essie was learning her equipment, and developing her eye as the trip progressed. The opening folios of African Journey, and there are 7 folios in all, feature many photographs taken from a distance and devoid of people. For example, photographs like typical Basuto village or palace of Mukama of Toro make an effort to take in as much of the scene as possible. Let's see, we'll come back to this. Panoramas aim to present a context of situation, as her teacher Bronislaw Malinowski endeavored in his own anthropological photography. As African Journey progresses, and as Essie settles into a particular place and establishes a rapport with the people she's met, her camera gets closer and closer to her subjects. Some of these photographs reflect the parameters of her fieldwork, a study of cattle culture in Uganda, in her words, and present careful visual categorizations that aim to catalog. But they also reflect her very real enthusiasm for the beauty of everyday objects. You can see some of that here. Similarly, Robeson's images of people start out in an ethnographic vein, but often produce insightful portraits in which her subjects smile back comfortably. Robeson chose to photograph the majority of her subjects in a manner that directly countered the visions of empire, which often sought the primitive and the iconic, the authentic, and the timeless. In contrast, Robeson's photographs feature weddings, schools, people in combination of Western and traditional or local dress. In these images, especially through the affirming genre of portraiture, her subjects emerge as modern individuals, navigating both pre-colonial histories and colonial exigencies. Through her camera, Essie also practices what we might call a modest gaze. Women almost always appear clothed, in contrast to the majority of photographs, postcards, films, and other visual ephemera that constructed Native women as savage and sexually available through visually equating nudity with primitivism. And these are actually some of the postcards that Essie purchased on her trip and are in her collections. Now, such framing might suggest a politics of respectability in which Essie imagines that a key way of elevating African women subjects in the eyes of European audiences is by visualizing them as modestly and chastely as possible. Indeed, an important goal of Robeson's trip was to seek out women in Uganda, in South Africa specifically. And this was not always easy, as Robeson's privilege placed her in a kind of liminal space as an honored guest under the protection of men, and not relegated to designated women's spaces. Her photographs, however, image women as often as she can, in marketplaces, in schools, in front of their homes. In Toro, Robeson spent the majority of her time with the herdswomen who handled the Basahi, the dairy. She describes this work as women's business, and the women who conducted as delightful, intelligent, companionable. She writes, "We enjoyed a lot of gossip while we worked, became very good friends, examined each other's hair, skin, clothes. We each found out how the other managed her husband, home, and children." Thus, we might understand these photographs, like many others, as reflecting relationality and exchange, the encounters that were at the heart of this trip. Robeson does not take camera work lightly. Throughout African Journey, she reveals that she is highly sensitive to the ways in which the camera, as an anthropological tool, can lay bare the unevenness in the relationship between anthropologists and her subjects. But more importantly, for the political commitments of the project between Black American and Black Africans. Robeson repeatedly asked permission to pull out her camera and make photographs, whether of people, of objects, or of workplaces, and waits until she has established a rapport. She says, she wrote, "I never bring my camera out unless I am sure no one will mind." She often offers something in return, whether photographs staged by the sitters themselves, as she did at the behest of the house staff in Toro, or money, as in the case of the Masero in South Africa, where Robeson paid the hospital fees of those folks she photographed outside of the dispensary. In each of these ways, Robeson describes and practices photography as a kind of diasporic civil contract. Photography is a tool that emphasizes mutual recognition between African diasporic subjects. And here I borrow from Ariella Azoulay's compelling concept of the civil contract of photography, in which Azoulay encourages us to envision the role of photographic spectatorship as one of civic duty, specifically in the case of images of the abused, the violated, the dispossessed. Azoulay writes, quote, "The nation-state re-territorializes citizenship. Photography, on the other hand, deterritorializes citizenship, reaching beyond its conventional borders and plotting out a political space in which the plurality of speech and action is actualized permanently by the eventual participation of all the governed. These governed are equally not governed within this space of photography where no sovereign power exists," end quote. In Azoulay's formulation, the civil contract of photography reinvigorates the radical potential and reinvigorates the radical political and liberatory potential of the medium of photography. One aspect of this political relation is to recall that the photograph is not merely the product of a technology, but also evidence of a set of relations. And I think David's talk yesterday, the conversation between David and Faye really brought that home. In the case of Robeson's African images, the photographs record an encounter between two differently marginalized people, the photographer and the photographed, who have shared a space and a time. In the making of the image, the partner participants enter a contract with one another and also with the users, later viewers of the photograph, one in which we agree to speak to, of, and on behalf of the image and its subjects. The photograph then is never simply a record of the past, but it's in its ability to travel physical and temporal distances. It's persistently extending viewing communities and reminding us that the effect and meaning of any photograph is never sealed off or determined in the final analysis. Photography's work is always in the present. It's always in the here and now. We might understand Robeson's commitment to photography as announcing her as, in Lee's words, a citizen in the citizenry of photography, which entails seeking, by means of photography, to rehabilitate one's citizenship or that of someone else who has been stripped of it, end quote. Or to put it another way, belonging. And this disposition is underscored by the presence of Paul Jr. throughout the photographs. Her young son, who, like a decolonizing or still colonized continent, she wants the world to see on his own terms. Robeson's photographs in African Journey draw on and blur the line between ethnographic photography and family snapshots. A desire to note the familiar unknowingly slips into recording the familial. If anthropological photography finds pleasure in difference, family snapshots locate joy and sameness in the filial and the familiar. In her dedication of the book to the brothers and sisters, Robeson is clearly hailing Africans as family and locating her Pan-Africanist political vision in the space of kinship. Paul Jr.'s presence in both text and image bring this conjuncture into sharp relief. It's the presence of Polly as traveling companion, interlocutor, photographic subject, and ward that brings the work of African Journey into focus. Paul Jr. was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1927, and for the first decade of his life lived primarily in England and Moscow, attending elite schools and largely isolated from other black children. For much of his life, up to the moment of this trip, Paul Jr. was looked after primarily by Essie's mother, Ma Good, while Essie traveled with Paul and managed her husband's business affairs. Essie often expressed enormous guilt about her extended absences as a mother. She did, however, have very clear ideas about how she wanted Paulie to be raised and what kind of person she hoped he would become. She committed these ideas to paper in lengthy letters of instruction to her mother, which I can only imagine how much her mother loved those letters. In one letter, composed a little over a year before the 1936 trip, Essie wrote that she wanted Paul Jr. to view himself the way Essie understood herself, quote, to feel perfectly at home and at ease in any company, to consider myself a pretty swell human being, and to look for human beings everywhere in any walk of life, to open up my mind and to think with it, to do impossible things, to be as good as I could, never to think I am being looked down upon. I unconsciously feel I'm top dog. That's the reason I am at home in any society. I want Paul to have that. Sorry. Okay. So though originally not the plan, it would seem that taking Paul Jr. along on this journey fit neatly into Essie's broader vision for her son. Quote, if some Africans on a film set open up a new world to the child, a trip to the heart of Africa itself will be a revelation. He will see millions of other brown and black people. He will see a black world. He will see a black continent, end quote. By intertwining her narrative of Africa with the experiences of her son, a dark male child, Essie alerts us to the fierce urgency of her vision for the African continent now and in the future. And here, Tina Camp's concept of haptic temporalities usefully extends Leigh, directing us toward the affective charge of these images. Camp describes haptic temporalities as affective temporalities initiated at their moments of production through a desire to create a material object of sentiment, to have and to hold. Polly's presence underscores the already domestic nature of these images. Essie, and by extension the viewer's familial relationship to the people she encounters, is triangulated and imbricated through Polly's appearance in so many of the photographs. To return to the photograph of Polly and the Matthews family, we are struck by the intimacy of relations, sensate and embodied, tactile and emotive. Photography scholar Mariana Hirsch asserts that the camera functions as the family's primary instrument of self-knowledge and self-representation, the primary means by which the family story is told. In the photograph, as well as in the three other family portraits in which Polly is featured, we might consider Essie Robeson as attempting to tell a new family story of, quote, Africa, my old country, my background, my people, and thus about myself. Paul serves as the link between Africa as anthropological research site and ancestral homeland. His presence also works to diminish the intrinsic distance between the Western observer occupying modernity and the authentic African fixed in a backward past. In doing so, Robeson asserts the here and now of African peoples, the urgency and exigency of African struggles in real time, and a new truth and authenticity of her subjects. But familial looking can be deceptive and divisive. The identification such imagery engenders, as Hirsch reminds us, can be too easy and can also draw lines of exclusion and disidentification. These problematics become clear in Essie's photos of Paul in a Twa village in Ngite, she called a pygmy village, which was a popular tourist site in the Ituri forest of the Belgian Congo. In this image, Paul stands to the far right side of the group of village elders. They consider each other with curiosity. Paulie and the village elders are all about the same height, around 4 feet 7 inches, and they occupy the same visual plane. This image certainly stands in contrast to popular safari photographs of full-grown white men and women who also visited Ngite, in which towering whiteness emphasized dissimilarity and worked to disparage and ridicule the Twa people. However, it is Paul's pith helmet, commonly worn by British officials in the tropics, with his hands thrust into his khaki pants, that mark him as foreign and highlights difference and distance. In the photograph with the Matthews family, Paulie's inclusion draws fictive, though still heartfelt bonds of kinship between the African-American Robesons and the Bantu Matthews, visually reconnecting the black family broken by and scattered in diaspora. As one woman proclaims of Paul Jr. on their trip, that boy belongs to us. See his mouth, eyes, nose, and the shape of head? Pure African. Oh yes, that boy belongs to Africa, to us. But as Essie stresses, the Twa are from another time and another place. She quotes author Grace Flandrau's description of pygmies as not Negro, and Essie describes them as having a, quote, Oriental cast. In the Ngite village photograph, Paulie's Western clothing and his place at the edge of the frame alert us to the challenges of a project that visualizes race, to quote Tina Campt, as the link that presupposes diasporic membership and is simultaneously the site of its questioning. The juxtaposition of these two images underscores that the attempt to forge a politically viable diasporic relationship in the present is not uncomplicated or without challenge. So I've tried to suggest that family photography was one mode through which Robeson attempted to forge solidarity and imagine community. Woven into her photographic practice, these filiative looks move us beyond guilt and compassion, outside of the merely psychological framework of empathy, of regarding the pain of others, and to quote Asley, on the basis of civic duty and the mutual trust of those who are governed. But more than this, I want to offer that family photography and the filiative look offers us a model to think about collaboration over longing, towards the recognition of human kinship, in Winter's words, that will lead us to greater freedom. Over the course of 3 months, Eslanda Robeson observed the suffering and resistance, dignity and degradation of the people she encountered. African Journey is bookended by Robeson's italicized assertions of African humanity. The book is dedicated to the brothers and sisters who will know whom I mean, and the narrative's concluding paragraph is a single sentence: Africans are people. In a global political and cultural climate that dismissed African peoples as primitive and eminently exploitable, such a contention bordered on the revolutionary. What lies in between the opening dedication to a self-selected family and the closing affirmation of African humanity are Robeson's descriptions of modern cities, ancient yet complex lifestyles, and locals who were either educated and worldly or poor and dignified. Her hope for the book was that it would, quote, take folks right out to Africa with me, taking them all the way there and all the way back, so you could know the folks, hear them talk, and see what I saw. Essie did not want to shy away from what she saw, nor did she want to embellish suffering. Rather, she chose to look and write with political commitment and human solidarity, almost always aware of her unique and privileged position. Thank you.